So I guess we'll just get started here. Um, mic, microphone. Hi, everybody.
No.
I'm Nick Dembowski. I'm sorry. Did I start the Zoom? Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Is there any way for the Zoom people to say they started the Zoom? That we started the Zoom? Okay. So I'm Nick Dembowski. I'm with the Kingsbridge Historical Society. I do want to thank the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum for having me down here. It's just a lovely night. I'm looking at this background. I've never had a nicer background for a Zoom. They're letting me talk about one of my favorite things, which is Kingsbridge during the American Revolution. Well, actually at the dawn of the American Revolution. So I'm going to get right into it. And, before I really get started, we sort of randomly decided on this date for this talk, August 27th, not knowing that this is the anniversary of one of the biggest battles, one of the most consequential battles of the American Revolution. This scene you're looking at right here, this happened in Brooklyn. But you're not hearing a lot about it in the news or around the city. That's because it's the 249th anniversary of this battle. 250 years ago was 1775, which doesn't get as much attention as 1776, obviously. But some would say that 1775 is the year that the revolution actually happened. And maybe that it was even over by the end of 1775. Now, what kind of crazy goofball would say something like that? John Adams. What do we mean by the American Revolution? The revolution was effected before the war commenced. The revolution was in the minds and hearts of the people. So John Adams, for one, thought the revolution was the great transformation that happened in the minds of the American colonists before the fighting even started. Americans turned against Parliament much before 1775. But through 1775, people that we call the founding fathers were still saying God save the king at the end of all of their meetings, their gatherings. In their petitions to the king, they were calling him their most gracious sovereign, wishing him a long and prosperous reign. So that's a big shift in 1 year to go from that to calling him a tyrant and toppling his statue down in Lower Manhattan, Bowling Green. And declaring independence. So that rethinking of how we were to be governed was the revolution, according to people like Adams. So in 2026, next year, you're going to hear a lot about the Declaration of Independence, about the battles, but I didn't want the anniversary of 1775 to go by without talking about the lead up to all that and that revolution in people's minds, and how that played out in New York and how it affected Kingsbridge. Now, when I say Kingsbridge, especially, during this time of the revolution, I'm not talking about this neighborhood, which you see in the center of this map. I'm going to see if I can point to some things here. So this is the Hudson River. It's not really going to work to point, but when people refer to Kingsbridge during the time of the revolution, they're basically talking about this area, including Inwood, Spuyten Duyvil, Riverdale, Norwood, Marble Hill. I mean, most of those names didn't exist. Marble Hill, Inwood, they're neighborhoods, but there weren't neighborhoods back then, and those names did not exist because the neighborhoods weren't here yet. So I'm going to show you a very old map from just before the revolution. This is a sketch of the environs of Kingsbridge. I think it's 1774, perhaps. And this map, which shows that same scene, the same as the Google map, there are about 15 houses here in all of Inwood, Riverdale, Spuyten Duyvil, and Kingsbridge. There are 3 taverns. And to give you some idea of what this area was like in 1774, 251 years ago, I'm going to take you on a little virtual journey through Kingsbridge. We're going to ride along in this crowded coach or carriage that was coming to Kingsbridge from Boston. It was carrying passengers, John Adams, Samuel Adams, Thomas Cushing, and 4 servants. And these guys were the delegates that the Bostonians were sending to the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia. Boston was under a blockade, which was part of the reason why they were having that convention. So they had to get here by land. And so they came into Kingsbridge via the Boston Post Road. Here's a contemporary Google map showing their route. Google says it's 3 hours and 45 minutes, but it was many more days than that for John Adams and Samuel Adams. So what I'm going to do is show you on modern maps how they got here, and then sort of juxtapose that with a map from the Revolutionary period. So they entered the West Bronx through the modern neighborhood of Williamsbridge, crossing the Bronx River here. But looking at this British military map from 1781, you can see that Williamsbridge wasn't a neighborhood, it was a bridge near the house of John Williams. And so they crossed the Bronx River this way. And as they did so, they may have looked out into the fields behind John Williams' house and seen John Williams harvesting hay in August of 1774, which is when this journey took place. May have seen a couple of enslaved people in the fields harvesting hay along with the farmer. And they would have seen the house of John Williams, which stood into the 20th century. And as they crossed the Bronx, traveling over what is today the Mosholu Parkway, Grand Concourse, and Jerome Avenue, or as it looked in those days on this British intelligence map, it would have looked a lot different, obviously, back then. It would have looked a lot like rural Vermont. You know, on the side of the road, there are these stacked stone walls. The soundscape would have been sheep and cows and horses. And it would have smelled like farmland as well. And at this time in August, the several orchards that they would have passed on the Boston Post Road would be teeming with ripening apples. And as they traveled the road, they would have heard a distant pinging sound getting louder. And that's because they're approaching the roadside blacksmith shop of Isaac Valentine. You can see that name Valentine on the map. And Valentine's house still stands in the Bronx. It's the Valentine Varian House, which is the Museum of Bronx History. If you're really paying attention and you know your stuff, you'll know that this Valentine Varian House is no longer on that old historic Boston Post Road. It's on Williamsbridge Oval. That's because it was moved in 1965. But continuing on this Boston Post Road west would take you over a route currently occupied by Bronx Science High School and the Jerome Park Reservoir. This part of the Bronx was not called the Bronx in 1774. It was still part of Yonkers in Westchester County. So politically, this is part of Yonkers. There's that same route. Now, John Adams very well may have been shooing mosquitoes out of his coach at this point because they're traveling through a very marshy area. You can see on this British intelligence map, there are indications that it's passable for infantry, impassable for coaches. That's because it's this marshy ground, and the generals wanted to know where they could march their troops. So in summary, they're going across the West Bronx this way. And that takes them to a point in what is today Kingsbridge Heights. You will notice on the map that you might see that there's a fort there, although it didn't exist in 1774 when Adams made this journey. But from Kingsbridge Heights, you would have an absolutely gorgeous view when you got to this point. Before you, there's this valley, maybe we call it the Valley of Kingsbridge, that was, you know, below this this precipice that they had gotten to in Kingsbridge Heights, and it was Tibbetts Brook that flowed through this valley, and it was a lush salt marsh. So this is a computer simulation of what that would have looked like. You could easily imagine a heron taking off out of this ecosystem, or some shorebirds harvesting mussels and oysters out of this. And beyond that valley, there was the hill of Riverdale and Spite and Ivel and Inwood Hill. And beyond that was the Hudson River and the Hudson River Palisades. So here they are. And as they travel down Kingsbridge Heights into the valley of Kingsbridge, what you're not seeing on this map are a couple of farms that were up there in Kingsbridge Heights. Those are the farms of Richard Montgomery and John Peter Tittard. Montgomery's farm was owned by a Major General Richard Montgomery. And to give you an idea of what his place was like and a better feel for the neighborhood, I'm going to read a real estate ad that he put in the paper in 1773. This was in Rivington's Gazetteer. To be sold at a private sale, a farm in the county of Westchester, just beyond Kingsbridge, containing about 70 acres of land, of which a considerable part is fresh and an excellent salt meadow. There is on the farm a commodious house and large barn, both of which have been lately repaired, and also a very good orchard. The situation of the house is extremely convenient, whether for a store, which is much wanted in that part of the country, or for a tavern, it being on one of the most public roads in the province. The situation of this farm is equally well adapted for a gentleman's country seat. It is on an eminence which commands a most agreeable prospect. Its distance from New York is not more than 15 miles, and it is surrounded by a most genteel neighborhood. You can see, I always get a kick out of these old real estate ads because they really do sound similar to modern real estate ads. When he talks about a most agreeable prospect, he's saying this has a great view. And if you were selling your apartment in Kingsbridge Heights today, you'd probably say the same thing. I don't know if you'd still call it a genteel neighborhood. The one mistake he makes, the real estate agent would tell him, is you don't tell people that a store is much wanted in that part of the country, right? It's got to be close to shopping. And so they passed by Montgomery's on the right, and they passed by this guy, John Peter Tittard's farm on the left on the Boston Post Road. And this wasn't just a farm, this was a French language boarding school. This is the ad in the paper for the boarding school. And it's saying that this Reverend John Peter Tittard teaches the French language in the most expeditious manner, together with some of the most useful sciences, such as geography and the doctrine of the sphere. That useful science, the doctrine of the sphere. The house is remarkable for its healthy situation, commanding one of the finest prospects in the government. So you're getting the picture? Great view from up here. So the delegation from Boston would have enjoyed that view as they descended into the valley of Kingsbridge, taking them to this spot. If anyone ever went to the old Piper's Kilt restaurant in Kingsbridge at West 230th and Albany Crescent, that's the next stop for them. And it just happens to be one of America's oldest intersections. It's where the Boston Post Road meets the Albany Post Road. And it still has the same course of the roads today. The maps look the same. So our group could have veered north and continued through Van Cortlandt Park and into all the way up to Albany, but they didn't. They hooked left and headed down to what is today West 230th and Broadway, where they did not stop at a Dunkin' Donuts, but they stopped at a place that was very similar to Dunkin' Donuts, which was a tavern. This was known as Cock's Tavern. The tavern keeper, John Cock, kept the tavern there. And the delegates spent the night there. And you can see this doesn't look like the landlocked intersection of 230th and Broadway. There's a creek flowing through it. That's the Spite and Ivel Creek, which separated Manhattan Island from Westchester, or today's Bronx. So John Adams spent the night there at that tavern, and he wrote that He lodged at Cox at Kingsbridge, a pretty place. So they weren't lying. It is pretty. The Uncas River running before the door, and verdant hills all around. This place is about 15 miles from New York. Uncas River is the bound between the county of Westchester and the county of New York. So you may be wondering, the Uncas River? That's a little peculiar, isn't it? I'm sort of thinking that he heard someone say it was the Yonkers River or the Yonkers River and wrote Uncas River. But it's more commonly called the Spite and Nibel Creek, of course. Now, take note of this innocent observation on Adams's part, that it was surrounded by these verdant hills, right? So, and if several years after this stay in Kingsbridge, those hills would have all been covered with fortifications. So here's another 1820-ish view of Kingsbridge looking down from the hill of Spite and Nibel, just to give you some idea of what everyone was going on about. And from there, in the next morning, they take maybe riding in their coach for a minute would take them to this modern day intersection, Kingsbridge Avenue and 230th Street. That's a contemporary view, taking this little journey here, where they're crossing the actual King's Bridge, for which Kingsbridge gets its name. This was the first bridge to Manhattan Island, built in 1693. And this photo shows it in its sort of last days as a bridge. I mean, it still exists. It's just buried along with the creek that's been filled in under the street there at 230th and Kingsbridge Avenue. So we're finally on Manhattan. This is another view of the King's Bridge. And they're going to hook around Marble Hill here, stopping at what is today, well, maybe they didn't stop, but they passed by what is today West 225th Street. And there would have been a cluster of buildings, another tavern. So you have within, 2-minute walk, another tavern right there. This was a tavern run by a man named Hyatt. It was called Hyatt's Tavern. Earlier, it was operated by the Dyckmans before they sold it off. And the two taverns were competing with one another. But it turns out this one, Hyatt's Tavern, was George Washington's favorite tavern. This is the one he stayed in when he was in Kingsbridge. So another ad. This is for when the Dyckmans decided they were going to get rid of this tavern. They sold it, putting an ad in the paper. Just a little, description here of the neighborhood. That most excellent farm at Kingsbridge, now in the possession of Mr. Samson Dyckman. He says it has a very good garden, orchard with the best of fruits, such as apples, pears, etc. It is most frequented and noted house on this island for travelers who pass Prince's Bridge. It has the advantage of mowing a large quantity of salt hay, etc. In the spring, it abounds with the most excellent bass, shad, and herrings, and crabs and oysters are most of the year are caught in great abundance. In short, it is the most convenient spot for a tavern keeper to make his fortune in a few years. Sounds pretty good. But what was the Prince's Bridge? So not only do we have two taverns, we had two bridges. So this one circled here is the King's Bridge, the first bridge, but that was a toll bridge. And in 1758, the local farmers finally decided they had enough paying these tolls. So they pooled their funds together and decided they were going to build this second bridge, which would be free. And it was most often called the Free Bridge or sometimes Dyckman's Bridge. But here, apparently, Samson Dyckman is calling it the Prince's Bridge. Then they would continue down into what we call Inwood today, maybe stealing a glance off to the right to catch this gorgeous view, looking towards the Palisades of New Jersey with Inwood Hill on the left there and Spite and Nibel on the right. This was drawn by a British artillery captain in 1776, Thomas Davies. And they'd continue down Inwood into what is now the rail yard there, passing the house of the Nagels. The Nagel house stood into the 20th century, right on the Harlem River there. And this road would continue meeting up with modern-day Broadway, where it would continue downtown. as they crossed through, as their travelers, John Adams and company, passed through Inwood, they would have passed by houses that once belonged to the Dyckmans. Not this one. This one wasn't built till after the war, but the Dyckmans had properties in Inwood. You can see on this another really lovely painting made by this British artillery captain that there are a few other houses there, sort of on the left. We're looking at the valley of Inwood with the Palisades in the distance, Porch on there on the hill behind them. So then they made their way downtown, met with a bunch of New Yorkers, and continued on to the Continental Congress. Sort of wonder how things went down in that tavern in Kingsbridge, though, when they showed up. When I'm going to move now from the physical landscape to the sort of social and political landscape. And it's a little hard to say because, there weren't public opinion polls performed at that time, and certainly not of this little area right here. But it couldn't have been too much of a surprise for local people to see John Adams and company passing through, because for a decade, people in this area had been hearing about all sorts of things going down in the city. And they would have heard about it. Things like the Stamp Act riots of 1765, where people were rioting in the street, burning effigies, ransacking the homes of British officials. There's the Battle of Golden Hill, which happened near today's City Hall Park, which was basically an all-out street brawl between British soldiers and New Yorkers. And then in 1774, there was not exactly a tea party, but a tea standoff where these British merchants were trying to unload tea in New York, and New Yorkers wouldn't let them unload the tea because of the tax on the tea. So on the flip side, in Kingsbridge, and Westchester County generally, there really wasn't that kind of turmoil. It was pretty calm. People were pretty content on the most part, it seems. Nor would they have been surprised to see people from Boston. Paul Revere made that same ride several times, including once in May of 1774. I know you're not going to be able to read this in the back, but this is an invoice that Paul Revere submitted to the committee in Boston for his ride, for a journey of my horse to Kingsbridge, New York, 234 miles, 30 pounds. Now, he was riding into New York City to try to rally New Yorkers to support Boston, because in 1774, that's when the British, they blockaded the port of Boston. They wanted to punish the whole population there until they got the money back that they lost from the Boston Tea Party. And so Paul Revere comes to New York thinking, I can convince these New Yorkers to help us, do something to get to deal with the situation. And the sort of political environment in New York, which was the same as it was in almost everywhere in colonial America, is that most of the people were actually kind of outside of the political system. In New York, there was a small number of Jews and Catholics. They weren't allowed to vote. There were indentured and enslaved men. They were not allowed to vote. And then there were, of course, women who weren't allowed to vote either. That's most of the population. Now, basically, who was in charge? You had your royal governor, who's appointed by the king's government, and then you have basically a collection of elite folks. I'm talking about people from families like the Livingstons, the Delanceys, the Schuylers, the Morrises. Who did I leave out? The Van Cortlands. And they were basically at the helm of government. They had seats. These were the guys that had the seats in the legislature of the colony, which was called the General Assembly. And they didn't approve of the taxes that Parliament was sending this way, but they always tended to side with the royal government when push came to shove, because they were looking to get royal appointments, positions where they'd get a salary from the British government. So most of these men were not eager to rock the boat, is what I'm saying. They had the best seats on the boat. They had the best, they had the cabin on the boat. They loved it on the boat. Whereas this next group, you could say, were sort of beneath them in the social pecking order, are your successful artisans, your your successful furniture makers, businessmen, tinsmiths, chandlers, tavern keepers, this sort of folk. And this group was also opposed to British Parliament's efforts to tax them. But this group was highly critical of those elites because they didn't take enough action. This group was eager to rock the boat. They were pushing boycotts against British goods. They made threats against British officials. They rallied street mobs and rioted and used violent means to show their discontent. And it was from this group of people that this organization, the Sons of Liberty, got their members. Leaders of the Sons of Liberty were guys like Isaac Sears, Alexander McDougall, John Lamb. They were corresponding with similarly rebellious and rambunctious people in Boston and other colonies. And they were the first to suggest that, hey, we should all get together, have a Continental Congress, and figure out how we're going to deal with the British. So these are the people pushing New York toward rebellion. So in summary, you have this sluggish elite not willing to rock the boat. You got this rebellious group of people who are, will resort to violence at a moment's notice. So both groups sort of had their downside. So there's this third group that emerges at the same time that Paul Revere shows up in May of 1774. A notice appears in this building downtown, the Tontine Coffee House, which is where the merchants tended to gather in lower Manhattan. And this note said that on May 16th, 1774, they were going to form a committee and have a meeting about how to address the situation in Boston, how the British closed down the port in Boston. And so these merchants gather at the Fraunces Tavern, which still stands, down in lower Manhattan. And they nominated 50 men to form a committee to organize New York's response to this Boston port closure. But when word got out that a group of merchants was going to try to form a committee to speak for all of New York, the Sons of Liberty weren't about to let that happen. So they crashed the next meeting and basically forced this group of merchants to add more members, more radical members. And when this committee went to nominate delegates for the Continental Congress, the Sons of Liberty basically forced these guys to promise that they were going to boycott British goods. That's what they wanted these delegates to pursue. So at this point, all these meetings are still ending with the words "God save the King." 3 cheers for the King. It's Parliament that they're angry at. And the Continental Congress happens. They write a petition to the king, but they also endorse that boycott of British goods. But what you have happening locally is a war of pamphlets. The Pamphlet War. This is late November 1774. And this will sort of be familiar to us. Think of this as sort of like posting about politics online, is what this was like. So in 1774, this pamphlet came out that made waves. It's like a viral post. Free thoughts on the proceedings of the Continental Congress held at Philadelphia, September 4th, 1774, wherein their errors are exhibited, their reasonings confuted, and the fatal tendency of their non-importation are laid out to the plainest understandings. And this was written by, well, it didn't say who was written by. It was under the pseudonym A Farmer, okay? And it was addressed to the farmers and other inhabitants of North America. So it was an attempt to influence farmers, the kind of people that are living in this area. Because, the farmers really weren't hit as hard as the people in the city by the British taxes. And this pamphlet argued that if the boycott ended up happening, the value of crops would fall, imported goods would be more expensive, and the value of your land would be so depressed that all those merchants downtown that are, pushing this agenda, they're going to come up and buy your devalued property. And then you don't have a farm. So maybe someone like William Dyckman, who had this house built, would have found that persuasive. So we do know the real author of this pamphlet was the Reverend Samuel Seabury, who was the minister over at St. Peter's Church in Westchester Square in the Bronx. And he was writing under this pseudonym A.W. Farmer which was supposed to stand for a Westchester farmer. So after you have your viral post, what do you get? You get your comments. And the first commenter was Alexander Hamilton. And he wrote a pamphlet in response, a full vindication of the measures of the Congress from the calumnies of their enemies, in answer to a letter under this name A.W. Farmer. And then in this pamphlet, Hamilton says that with regard to A.W. Farmer, this pamphlet is going to expose his sophistry, confute his cavils, detect his artifices, and ridicule his wit. It was very Hamiltonian. And Hamilton, I think, was 18 years old when he wrote this pamphlet. Doesn't this remind you of how people behave online when talking about politics? So A.W. Farmer writes his retort, another pamphlet. This one is, addressed to the merchants downtown, telling them that, basically you're pursuing a selfish agenda that's going to ruin everybody's lives. And so there's this pamphlet war going back and forth up until 1775, when the big question of the day was, who's going to represent New York at the next Continental Congress? And this was a question that was debated in today's Bronx, in New York City, up in White Plains, which was the county seat of Westchester County. We don't actually know what people were saying about it right here, but we have these neighboring places that were influencing this area. So I'm going to take you to look at how they decided in these different places. And it's all different ways in each place, but sneakiness, intimidation were factors in this process in every place, except at Old City Hall, where that official government legislature, the General Assembly, was meeting. They were opposed to the Continental Congress. They thought it was illegitimate. So, but they had to sort of appeal to public anger. So they did write this petition to the king where they complained about the taxes, and they sent it to Britain, and the British refused to even read it. But over here in what is was and still is Westchester Square in the Bronx. So it's a little confusing. It's Westchester, but it's in the Bronx. This is where Westchester got started, in the Bronx, in the East Bronx, in this town. This is in March. There was a gathering to address this question of who are we going to send to represent us at the Second Continental Congress. And at this gathering, they proclaimed that they already had representatives in the General Assembly, so they didn't need no stinking Continental Congress. And they sang God Save the King. They spent the day drinking, and then they went home. And this is something you see sometimes in local politics. I have a hard time believing there was nobody in the Bronx who supported the Second Continental Congress. If you know you're going to have an opposition at your meeting, you just don't tell the opposition that you're going to have a meeting. And then it goes real smooth from there. Down in Lower Manhattan, sort of a similar thing happening. They were going to have a meeting not to select the delegates of the Continental Congress, but to select a committee that would select the delegates of the Continental Congress. These people were like committee crazy. They had so many committees. So the officers of the British Army and the British Navy show up at this meeting at the Merchants Exchange in Lower Manhattan. And the conservative or moderate guys of the General Assembly show up at this meeting, and they're probably hoping that something along the lines of what just happened in Westchester Square can happen down here, that everyone's going to decide, yeah, we don't need to do this. But the Sons of Liberty, of course, weren't about to let that happen. So the Sons of Liberty threw a big party up at what is now City Hall Park, where they had their Liberty pole, and they got a band playing. They, got everybody nice and liquored up. They did a parade around town and picked up, every unemployed sailor and street tough and brought them down to this meeting to intimidate the merchants there. And it worked because, when the two crowds converged, there was a little brawl, a little tussle. But they eventually got down to business and did nominate this committee that was going to nominate delegates to the Continental Congress. White Plains is a sort of a funnier and different story. It's the tale of two taverns. There's two taverns in White Plains, Hatfield's Tavern and Oakley's Tavern. And at Hatfield's Tavern, um, all the guys that were meeting that were opposed to sending delegates to the Continental Congress. And they were especially opposed to sending this guy, Colonel Lewis Morris, who was Westchester's representative. And this guy was a really controversial figure. You know, he lost an election in 1768 by one vote to his arch rival, the Delanceys. And for, decades and decades, the Delanceys and the Morrises were competing against each other for these elections. And then he did win the next election in 1769, but then that was invalidated when they, looked at ballots, and it invalidated some of the ballots. So this is the sort of, I mean, you can make parallels to the modern day where there's these close elections and people get so worked up. And so he had a big group of haters gathered at this tavern in White Plains, Hatfield's Tavern, and they were waiting for the meeting to start over at the courthouse across the street. But in a neighboring tavern, Oakley's Tavern, there were the men that were supporting Lewis Morris. And they had gathered and they were drinking in the tavern, and they were going to start the meeting, but they noticed they had a problem. They were outnumbered. There were more anti-Morris people than pro-Morris people. So they were delaying this meeting for a couple hours, let the anti-Morris crowd get nice and liquored up. And what they did is they real sneakily crept out of Oakley's Tavern and snuck into the courthouse, bang the gavel, make Lewis Morris the chair of the meeting, and start the meeting without telling the anti-Morris crowd. So the anti-Morris crowd, they catch wind of this, they bust into the courthouse, and they're furious. And Lewis Morris, who's the chair, said, "You don't have the right to vote. You don't have the right to vote. You don't have the right to vote." And Frederick Phillips III, who was leading this anti-Morris crowd, he says, "Well, this is an illegal, illegitimate assembly anyway. We don't want to vote." And they sang, "God save our gracious king." And then they left and went back to the tavern. But the meeting went on, and guess who they nominated to go to the committee for the Continental Congress? It was Lewis Morris, of course. So you see this pattern emerging. I mean, we have this idea that, I associate the American Revolution with the beginnings of democracy in this country, but there's a whole lot of chicanery going on to make it work. You can read that in the back. So this is a letter in Rivington and published in Rivington's Gazette just after this meeting. This is a long list of hundreds of names. People in Westchester County signed this document saying, we abhor all these committees and congresses. That meeting up in White Plains was a travesty. We support the king and we support the Constitution, and we want nothing to do with this Continental Congress business. So of all the times to put a notice in the paper saying that you support the king and the Constitution and you hate the Continental Congress, April of 1775 was like the worst time, because later that week you had the first battles of the American Revolution. You had the battles of Lexington and Concord. And this changed everything. It changed the vibe. It did a 180. And this is when people started paying real close attention to Kingsbridge. For one thing, this son of liberty, Isaac Sears, once the news reached New York on April 23rd, this guy had just busted out of prison. And then once the news broke that basically the fighting had started, he got 360 armed men together. They go down to the port, storm the customs house, steal all the cannons, and start dragging them up here to Kingsbridge to keep them out of British hands. And a lawyer in New York City, a guy named William Smith, kept a really detailed diary, and he wrote about this time. The merchants are amazed and yet so humbled as only to sign or complain in whispers. So they're intimidated. They don't want to complain about what the sort of vigilantism that's happening, because they're scared, because the mood had shifted so much in the radical direction. Now, what does he mean by they were so humbled as only to sign? Well, everyone was sort of expected to sign these documents called the General Association. And in this document, you're sort of swearing, it's like an oath of allegiance. You're swearing to adopt and endeavor to carry into execution whatever measures may be recommended by the Continental Congress or resolved upon by our provincial Congress. Can you imagine signing a document saying you will do whatever Congress says? That's what these people did. And so, and then they refer to a provincial Congress, which was sort of like the local version, the New York legislature. And while this is all going on, the Second Continental Congress is meeting in Philadelphia. And their very first resolve or order issued to New York is that New Yorkers make a fort or a post, and that it be immediately taken and fortified at or near Kingsbridge in the colony of New York, that the ground to be chosen with a particular view to prevent the communication between the city of New York and the country from being interrupted by land. So translation, the Continental Congress says you got to build a fort up in Kingsbridge because this is our way on and off the island. The British were to land here, they could block us from leaving Manhattan. So they sent a couple of local guys, the General Richard Montgomery, who I mentioned lives in Kingsbridge Heights, and Colonel James Van Cortlandt, who lived in the Van Cortlandt House in the Van Cortlandt Park, to scout out where exactly they were going to build a fort. And they quickly came to the conclusion that you really couldn't build just one fort to defend the bridge because there are all these hills around the bridge. So if you build a fort on one hill, you'd have to build it on the next hill, otherwise the cannons from that hill are going to fire at you. So they weren't able to decide where to build a fort, and no fort was built. In the words of Gouverneur Morris, no fortification could be so constructed as to be tenable for any length of time because of the great irregularity of the ground on Manhattan's Island. So it's a hilly island. So the second order of the Continental Congress was that the men of each community get together and form a militia company. So basically, a militia company, that's, regular people, farmers, blacksmiths, millers, regular people who are called upon to train and learn a little bit of and drill and learn a little bit about fighting. And so that if there's ever an attack, they could come out and defend the community against attack. And when it comes to the American Revolution, you might sometimes hear academic historians, professors say that the American Revolution was not really that revolutionary compared to something like the French Revolution, where there's this complete overturning of the social order. In America, you had elites in charge before, elites in charge after, great number of enslaved people and people that didn't have rights. But something was happening around this militia company formation that I think was in fact revolutionary. So again, sorry about the list of names and small type here. What happened in South Yonkers or in Kingsbridge was that the men of the militia company, they cast their votes for who was going to be their officers. So they got to elect their captain, their lieutenants, and their ensign. And this is a radical departure from what the British were doing. In the British Army, you were either appointed into your position, or if you were rich enough, you could literally just pay to become a colonel. You pay some money and you're given this position. So this is very, very different. And the men, when given the choice of who they're going to vote for, they voted for the local tavern keeper, of course, who everybody knew. But he was chosen for his known skill and ability in the military discipline. This is John Cox, the tavern keeper at 230th and Broadway, where the Dunkin' Donuts is today. And so he got the most votes. He became the captain. And, you could imagine, well, this happened basically 250 years ago on Sunday, this election. So you can imagine a few days later, maybe 250 years ago today, the men of this militia company mustered somewhere in Kingsbridge, drilling, practicing. But you don't have to imagine it because a local artist drew it. Gary Zaboli, a Bronx artist, drew this picture of the South Yonkers Militia Company mustered in the center of Kingsbridge in August of 1775. So that's Kingsbridge Heights in the background, the farms of Richard Montgomery and John Peters Retard back there. And what you have in the foreground is the tavern keeper, John Cock, on the left. He's the captain. He's reading the newspaper to the troops, updating them on the news of the war and the revolution. But zooming in on the men themselves, no one has really bothered to look too carefully at these militia roles before, but I did do that, and some things stood out to me. For one thing, John Cock was not the only person to get votes for captain. The person who came in second place was Frederick Van Cortlandt, and he's one of society's elites. You know, he's like the top 1%, very rich person. And he lost the election to this tavern keeper. And, you know, he must have felt that he deserved that role, being the big shot in the neighborhood. And after he lost the election, Frederick Van Cortlandt serves in this militia company as a private. And who is he serving next to? He's serving next to someone named Robert Brown. Robert Brown was another private in this militia company. And we know that the only Robert Brown in this neighborhood was a formerly enslaved man of a multiracial person. And it's just remarkable to me that you have both of these men, Robert Brown and Frederick Van Cortlandt, on the same level, both privates. They both had one vote in that election for captain. It's probably the first time ever this formerly enslaved person had the right to vote in any capacity. And they each had one vote, and they had the same position. And, you know, Frederick Van Cortlandt, he was an enslaver. So he enslaved people, and here he's serving next to a formerly enslaved person. That same artist, Gary Zaboli, he painted a portrait of what he thought Robert Brown might look like. We're very fortunate to have had the funds to produce this artwork. And when Robert Brown was orphaned as a child, he was raised by neighbors. And even though there are a great number of last names in that militia company, they were all, there were a lot of people were related. They were, you know, if you're a farmer, your kids tended to marry the kids of the farmer next door. So, you know, in this area today, you run into somebody on the street, you might not ever see that person again. Back then, that might be your cousin. So this is a tightly knit community, but things were about to change. Do these men look like they are sneering, maybe giving the captain a dirty look? Maybe one of these men is William Hadley, a private in the militia and the local blacksmith. William Hadley would claim that he brought the General Association document, sort of like that loyalty oath, to John Cock, the captain, to sign, you know, pledging allegiance to the Continental Congress, and that John Cock, taking the pen in his hand, uttered the following words: "I sign this with my hand, but not with my heart, for I would not have signed it had it not been for my wife and my family's sake." And this he several times repeated. So the captain of the militia company allegedly was, you know, operating out of fear. He signed this oath because he feared for his family's safety. And so what you have after that accusation is leveled, you have another petition showing up in the paper where men in this militia company said, "Hey, we voted for this guy, John Cock, and we think that this accusation against him is motivated by spite and malice. But as a result of this accusation, the captain, John Cock, lost his command." So in conclusion, up until 1775, even though the colonists were angry at Parliament, they were still unified in praising and saying "God save the King" at the end of every meeting. But as you can see, the bonds between people were fraying along the lines of who would continue to praise the king and who would give their loyalty over to the Continental Congress. And in the years that followed, the buildings in the background here and the orchards would all be burned down and destroyed. And the people in the foreground, they would fight against each other on different sides of the war. And this community in Kingsbridge found itself on the front lines of the most dramatic and violent years this area has ever known. So the decision these people made to govern themselves differently is what John Adams said was the real revolution. And that's the end. And you were my guinea pigs because I never thought I could get away with talking about the American Revolution and not talking about the battles. But I didn't want, I figured, next year everyone's going to be talking about the battles and the ships and the cannons, and I can come back and talk about that. I love the battles, but I figured there's never going to be another time that people are willing to listen to the events of 1775. So thank you for indulging. Do you have any questions that I can answer? Yeah, Robert?
Well, two. One, wait, so you said this was a reconstruction or was this?
Yeah, so the Kingsbridge Historical Society, we hired this artist. We worked with this artist to reconstruct in our minds, what the view would be, where the houses were, what the people would be wearing. We did a lot of research to create these images. This is one of several, to, depict scenes that have never been depicted before.
Like most of the animus was directed at Parliament, but looking at the Declaration, it's all aimed at the king. So what sort of was that?
So the shift was the battles, the when the fighting. So the question was, for years people were complaining about Parliament, but in the Declaration of Independence, they're talking about and condemning the king's rule. So what explains that shift? And I think you really notice the difference after the first battles of Lexington and Concord. There was like a shock to Americans that their king, that they're all, we had statues of King George III in Lower Manhattan that were paid for by the colonists out of appreciation for their king. They're singing songs for the king, they're praising the king, and all of a sudden, his army is going to come and mow down the militia at Lexington. And then from then on, it was just one thing after another. The colonists had sort of let themselves believe that it was the king's ministers that were like controlling him and telling him what to do. And you see this in like communist countries, like in Soviet Russia. People said, if only Stalin knew what was going on in his name, But I mean, the king was really wanted to crush this rebellion from the beginning. So, it was the Battle of Lexington, Concord, and then the worst thing he did was he hired these Germans, the Hessians, to fight on his side. And then they're like, forget this guy. Yes.
So is this artwork hanging in your building at the historical?
A copy of it is hanging in the building.
And
We have 4 portraits. The one of Robert Brown is hanging. There's a one of Margaret Corbin, the woman who famously took over a cannon emplacement here in Upper Manhattan to fire at the British. We have one of Chief Daniel Nimham, who was a Stockbridge, Muncie chief who fought with the Patriots in the Revolution. He died in Van Cortlandt Park. And the last one is of one of these Hessian soldiers who was stationed here in Upper Manhattan and Spuyten Duyvil and kept a meticulous diary of every day he spent here in Upper Manhattan and the Bronx, and it's really interesting to read.
And there was a slide about White Plains being the first capital of New York.
Did I say that? All right. All right. Oh, well, White Plains was the county seat of Westchester County. So there's the county courthouse there, and that's sort of like the center of county politics, but it was not the first capital of New York. No. Yes.
Yeah, I was wondering, you haven't mentioned any of the native people. Were there native people around? Were they part of, just mentioned somebody fighting?
Yeah. So in terms of the native people, by 1776, 1775, if there were native people in this vicinity, we're talking about a couple square miles here, then they were hiding out pretty much or living, mostly on the margins of society, maybe in the woods or something like that. The last document I found indicating that native people were still thriving in this area is is from 1744. And you know, I was mentioning that tavern at 230th and Broadway, Cox Tavern. A traveler to that tavern in 1774 went out the door in the morning and saw a group of native people who we could assume were Muncie Lenape people fishing for oysters in the Spite and Ivel Creek. But I mean, they're basically, their land was essentially gone. Their livelihoods, which you know, were dependent on trapping for so many years, the animals had been killed off. So they had moved up into, you know, further away from the coast, some of them being absorbed by that Stockbridge, Muncie community that was centered in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. And for the most part, but the native people of New York more generally tended to side with the British, who were holding back the colonists from encroaching further into their land. Yes, Catherine.
Geography of the break between Inwood and Spite and Dival, the Kingsbridge that you showed was not there. It was north. It was at two.
All right, let me go back through here, because it is confusing, because the landscape today is not the same landscape as it was in 1776. So let's stop right here on this slide. So what you see in the foreground where the red dot is, that's Marble Hill. Okay. Marble Hill, at this point, and when this map was made in 1781, it was still attached to the island of Manhattan. Okay, so it's part of the island. But nowadays, let me find a contemporary map. Nowadays, there's basically that same view. Marble Hill has been chopped off of Manhattan to create, in 1895, this ship canal that allowed boats to get around Manhattan Island, bigger boats. So basically, we have a piece of Manhattan now attached to the Bronx. So where the Kingsbridge was, crossing over the Spite and Ivel Creek, there's no longer any water there.
And was that charging the Phillipses?
So were people charging the Phillipses to?
No, it's Phillips that
Yeah, so it was a toll road, and it was, so Frederick Phillips was this manor proprietor. He owned property from here in Spite and Ivel, Kingsbridge, all the way up to the Croton River in northern Westchester. That was his land on the west side of the county. And he owned this bridge, and he owned the tavern on the corner. And the King William and Mary, they gave him this manorial grant with the right to charge a toll over this bridge, except for the king's troops could pass over for free. But there's this whole schedule of what he was allowed to charge, like a 4-footed animal, he was allowed to charge this much for, you know, for people had to pay this much to cross the toll. And so the farmers, they're driving their cattle over the bridge, and they have to pay a fortune to get their cattle down to Lower Manhattan. So that's why they get ticked off and build this free bridge right next to it. Question.
Where did the money go?
Where did the money go?
There.
You mean the
Kingsbridge.
Kingsbridge? Yeah, well, that money would have gone to Frederick Phillips. You know, he paid for constructing the bridge. Now, that bridge was almost certainly made by enslaved people, because Frederick Phillips, who owned the bridge, he was one of New York's biggest slave traders and a enslaver of over 40 people. So there's no way he built that bridge himself. It's sort of, you know, we talk about the wall for Wall Street was built by enslaved people. So was the first bridge to Manhattan. Is that it? One last question? And feel free to take off if you, maybe I'll end it now. And anyone else who wants to come up and ask a question, feel free. Thank you, folks online.